Welcome to this presentation on the Book of Revelation. Here we will be looking at chapter 12. This is the second of two presentations on this subject. The first presentation described one of the misconceptions that many people have about what this chapter is about, a misconception based on trying to take these verses literally, and then they interpret a woman fleeing into the wilderness as representing Mary. In this presentation, we'll describe a symbolic interpretation of these verses, and we'll try to explain what this woman represents. The chapter as a whole could be described as an overall perspective of God's plan, looking at what's been going on the earth from an overview. The previous chapters have been describing the course of human history down from Roman times up until about the 1500s or thereabouts, and it's been a gradual unfolding of a history of the what might be termed the Roman earth, particularly Europe and Middle East, North Africa, that region of the world. Now in chapter 12 we get a little bit of a break with this new subject that is raised in these verses. In Revelation 12 verse 1, "And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars." And the picture on the bottom right shows or tries to capture this image, but it's captured it incorrectly. It has a woman standing upon this dragon, which is not what these verses describe. But it is consistent with the way people have misinterpreted these verses. So the question is, who is this woman, or what does she represent? And there are many that believe a woman is Mary, and particularly in the Roman Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, and parts of Church of England as well, perhaps, and they see this woman as representing Mary. But we've seen how that really leads people off in incorrect directions. A second interpretation that some people have put forward is that this woman represents the church, but this really doesn't seem to fit very well. When we look at the remaining verses, the church didn't give birth to Christ, the other way around, if anything. When we look at the actual symbols that are depicted here, it's quite clear that the woman represents Israel. And what are some of the other possibilities? Some people might have suggested that the woman represents Europe, because Europe has now got a flag with 12 stars on it, but this is perhaps more to do with the first interpretation of the woman representing Mary, and this carrying forth into the Catholic Church and their role in trying to guide Europe. And perhaps that's why the European Union now has 12 stars, even though it has 27 member countries at the moment. Are there any other interpretations? It's very unclear if there are any. They're very obscure. So when we look at these things, we're concluded that either we have to accept Mary as the woman described here, or these verses are symbolically representing Israel. And these are the only two barely sensible options. Now, the reasons for identifying the woman as Israel, we see that Israel was represented by sun, moon, and 12 stars. Just as we've read in verse 1 there, the sun, moon, and 12 stars. In Genesis 37, you can read it at your leisure, it talks about Joseph's dream. in which his star was represented as having the other 11 stars, and the sun and the moon representing his mother, all bowing down to him. So these clearly represent the whole family of Israel. In the Old Testament and some of the prophets, Israel is often represented in terms of a woman. In Isaiah 54, and we don't have time to look at all of these verses, but verses 4 through to 10 include, "Thy Maker is thine husband, the Lord of hosts is his name. The Lord hath called thee as a woman, with great mercies I will gather thee." Also we read Israel being represented as giving birth to a son in Isaiah 9 verse 6, "Unto us a child is born." Now Isaiah was prophesying to Old Testament Israel, so he's saying, "Unto us Israel a child is born." But through Israel, of course, the child was born to the entire world. But it really was through Israel and the remnant that was in Palestine at the time that Jesus was brought into the world. It's interesting to note, and these are important verses to note, that in Jeremiah 31 verses 35 it says, "Thus saith the Lord, which giveth the sun for a light by day, and the ordinances of the moon and of the stars for a light by night, which divideth the sea when the waves thereof roar. The Lord of hosts is his name. If these ordinances depart from before me, saith the Lord, then the seed of Israel shall cease from being a nation before me forever." So as long as there are sun, moon and stars, Israel would continue as a people or a nation before the Lord. So this is a prophecy by Jeremiah. And if you know the book of Jeremiah, Jeremiah was a prophet really at the end of what might be called Old Testament Israel, at a time when they were on the last legs, and eventually during Jeremiah's time the remnant in Judah was taken captive into Babylon, and the temple was finally destroyed in 586 BC. And so the nation at that point could be said to be well and truly gone, although they did return back to the promised land 70 years later. But the point is just that Jeremiah was prophesying at a time when Israel was just a remnant, pretty much nothing. But despite that, he's saying as long as the sun, moon and stars, Israel would continue as a people. Also the verse quoted previously, Isaiah 9 verse 6. This is a favourite verse referred to at Christmas time, of course, and it says, "For unto us a child is born, and unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace." So the government shall be upon his shoulder. So we would think that there needs to be something for him to govern. Revelation 12 and verse 2, "And she being with child," that's the woman, "cried, travailing in birth, and pain to be delivered." And for Israel, the birth or bringing forth Jesus was indeed a very painful process, and we know that, of course, through many of the things that were written then. They had a very difficult time being oppressed by the Romans, and they had Herod there killing all the young children to try and kill Jesus. But just as a bit of a side note, in Genesis 3:16, the pain of childbirth is associated with sin brought into the world through Adam and Eve. So she being with child cried, travailing in birth, and pain to be delivered. It's a pain of childbirth, but that pain is because of a sin that was brought into the world, and that doesn't fit with the Catholic interpretation of Mary as a sinless entity, that they depict her as sinless, free from the stain of original sin, free from sin throughout the rest of her life, immaculate, supposedly. And that doesn't square up at all with she being in pain when she gives birth. Again, one small indication that this almost certainly isn't talking about Mary. Revelation 12 and verse 3, and there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads. And what is this dragon? Well, this is answered in detail in Daniel chapter 7, Revelation 13, Revelation 17, and we'll cover these things again. But basically, this dragon represents the Babylonian sequence of kingdoms, starting with ancient Babylon, going through to Persia, Greece, Rome, and then the nations of Europe. And the 7 heads represent the 7 hills of ancient Rome, and the 10 horns represent the 10 kingdoms of Europe, because it's a kingdom or a beast that's surviving down through the ages. And in this case, we notice that the 7 crowns are upon his heads, indicating that the time period when these crowns are ruling, these kingdoms are ruling, is during ancient Rome. In Revelation 17, verse 9, here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth. And in Daniel 7, verse 23, thus he said, the 4th beast shall be the 4th kingdom upon the earth, which shall be diverse from all kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, and shall tread it down and break it in pieces. And the 10 horns out of his kingdom are 10 kingdoms that shall arise, and another shall arise after them. He shall be diverse from the first, and shall subdue 3 kings. So Rome was famous in the ancient world as a city built on 7 hills. And after its fall came the nations of Europe, represented by the 10 horns, also represented by the feet of iron and clay in Daniel chapter 2. And again we see the number 2 there, the 10 toes perhaps. And the crowns on the heads, as we just mentioned, are on the heads, indicating that Roman Empire is ruling in the time of the prophecies that we're looking at now. In chapter 13, the crowns are on the horns, meaning that chapter 13 is describing the time of the European nations. And this is a huge story about the dragon that we have very little time for, but it's interesting to note that in the middle of a coat of arms of Pope Gregory XIII is the winged dragon, and a similar emblem appears on his tomb and medallions. And the Roman Catholic Church, and particularly the papacy in its political role, was a successor to the Roman Empire, and the papacy can be identified as the little horn that we just read about. And to a large degree we're talking here in terms of politics and kingdoms rather than religion and doctrines. Revelation 12 and verse 4, and his tail, that's the dragon, the Roman Empire, drew the 3rd part of the stars of heaven that cast them to the earth, and the dragon stood before the woman which was ready to be devoured, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. So the eastern third of the empire was acquired by Rome in the century before Christ, and this was done in preparation for the arrival of Israel's child, Jesus. Syria fell in 64 BC, Jerusalem 63, and Egypt 30 BC. So all these things just prior to the birth of Christ, drawing this third part to the earth, incorporating them into its own empire. And the dragon is ready there, ready to try and kill Jesus when he is born. And Herod, as representative of a Roman Empire and also an Idumean Jew, tries to kill Jesus as a child. In Matthew 2, verse 16, then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, was exceeding wroth, and sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem, and in all the coast thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. Then was fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, in Ramah there was a voice heard, lamentation and weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and would not be comforted, because they were not. So here we see the Roman Empire with its representative trying to kill Jesus, but failing. And the image that's presented here is like this giant beast, giant monster trying to kill this baby and failing. Revelation 12 and verse 5. And she brought forth a man-child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up unto God and to his throne. So the man-child is obviously referring to Christ. And obviously, after the day of Pentecost, prior to the day of Pentecost, after the crucifixion, Jesus was caught up into heaven, ascended into heaven bodily, seen by his disciples. The man-child is obviously Jesus Christ. Acts 1 verse 9, and when he had spoken these things while they beheld, he was taken up, and a cloud received him out of their sight. And while they looked steadfastly toward heaven as he went up, behold, 2 men stood by them in white apparel, which also said, Ye men of Galilee, why stand ye gazing up into heaven? The same Jesus which is taken up from you into heaven shall so come in like manner, as you have seen him go up into heaven. The rod of iron, this is also a clear indication of Jesus Christ, symbolic language obviously, not that he's really going to use a lump of metal to rule people, but in Psalm 2 verse 7, I will declare the decree. The Lord hath said unto me, Thou art my son, this day I have begotten thee. Ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron, thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Obviously things that have not yet come to pass, but one day the Lord is going to return and rule, and rule in great strength, as is represented there with a rod of iron. The iron, of course, doesn't bend or break. Instead, it shatters in pieces the things that it comes in contact with in force. So at his return, Christ will reign with the rod of iron. Also in Revelation 19, verse 15, and out of his mouth goeth a sharp sword, that with it he should smite the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. And he treadeth the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of God Almighty, of Almighty God. And also those that overcome will reign with Christ. Revelation 2 verse 25, but that which ye have already hold fast till I come, and he that overcometh and keepeth my works unto the end, to him will I give power over the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron, as the vessels of a potter shall they be broken to shivers, even as I received of my Father. Revelation 12 and verse 6, and the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. So now we hear about Israel, and we've already read that Israel was going to be a nation or a people forever before the Lord, but it was going to flee into the wilderness. We need to remember at this point that Israel was not just the Jews, there was also the 10 tribes of Israel that were taken captive into Assyria and appear to have disappeared from the pages of history. In actual fact, they were, as far as we can tell, they were around the outskirts of the Roman Empire. Josephus says, writing in about 70 AD, there are but 2 tribes in Asia and Europe subject to the Romans, while the 10 tribes are beyond the Euphrates till now, and are an immense multitude not to be estimated by numbers. So in addition to the Jews who are within the Roman Empire, there's a great multitude that's outside the empire. This multitude originally, of course, taken captive into Assyria, and then from thenceforth they went north, and beyond that, history doesn't clearly identify what happened to them. In Hosea chapter 2 and verse 12, it says, "Therefore, behold, I will allure her, and bring her into the wilderness, and speak comfortably unto her." So Israel was going to be taken into the wilderness, and once in the wilderness, the Lord was going to speak comfortably to her. She wasn't going to disappear or vanish into nothingness. That's what these verses are clearly indicating to us. And the wilderness means what you might call the area outside the civilized earth, the Roman earth, if you want to call it, the civilized earth. The wilderness was the barbarian regions outside of those countries. So there was going to be a new place for the people of Israel in 2 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 10. "Moreover, I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, that they may dwell in a place of their own, and move no more. Neither shall the children of wickedness afflict them any more, as before time." Now, when Samuel was giving these prophecies, this is even before there were kingdoms in Israel. This was a time when Israel was in the land of Canaan. They were in the promised land. They were already dwelling in the place. But the Lord saying, "I will appoint a place for my people and plant them." Obviously plant them somewhere else, somewhere that they're not going to be afflicted. In Canaan, they were continually afflicted, first of all by the Philistines, and later on by the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Egyptians and various other peoples, continually afflicted by the children of wickedness. But Israel were going to get a new place where they weren't going to be afflicted anymore, and they weren't going to move anymore. They were going to move no more. So once in this new place, they would not need to move at all. Now this doesn't fit with the history of the Jews, because the Jews were continually on the move. They were never safe or secure wherever they went. Wherever their foot trod, they dwelt in fear and anguish. They spread through the Roman Empire and the various other countries in Europe and into Russia and many other countries, and wherever they went they were persecuted, and they never had a safe place to dwell of their own. So these verses appear to be not talking about the Jews, but they were talking about Israel. So presumably they are talking about the lost 10 tribes of Israel. And many people believe in the British Israel, a subject too big to cover here, but here the 10 tribes of Israel eventually migrated into the British Isles. And some of the identifying marks of Israel, Genesis 28, verse 14, and thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth, and thou shalt spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And the British Empire at its heydays certainly did fulfill that, spreading to all four compass points. In Jeremiah 31, verses 7 through to 10, it includes, declare it in the isles afar off, and say, he who scattered Israel will gather him. They were scattered when they were taken out of Palestine, out of the land of Israel, when they were taken by the Assyrians, but then they were going to be gathered in the isles afar off. In Hosea 2, verse 17, they shall no more be remembered by their name. And this is a subtle clue that they'd no longer be known as Israel. Instead, they would lose they would lose their identity in that sense, in the sense of not knowing their name. Now, if we look at the time period that's been depicted here, the 1260 years, or 3.5 times, when Israel was deported to Assyria, that took place from about the middle of 700s BC, perhaps 734 to 721. It was definitely concluded by 721 BC when the northern capital of Samaria was taken captive by the Assyrians. And so if we add a time in the wilderness, a time of 1260 years, we come to a time of around 500 to 550 AD, and this coincides with the migrations of many peoples into Britain, including the Angles and the Saxons. Now, just to come back to the question of what about the remnant of the Jews in Palestine, 70 AD, the Jerusalem was recaptured by the Romans and the temple destroyed after a revolt. The Jews revolted again in 135 AD, and as a result, Emperor Hadrian forbade them from entering Jerusalem, renamed the whole province as Palestine, named after the Philistines, as a calculated insult to the Jews, and the Jews were persecuted and hounded wherever they went. In some parts of the world, sometimes in the Muslim world, they were tolerated, the relative peace, although still as second-class citizens. But by the time we get to 1260 years after these dates, we come to a time when there's extreme persecution in Europe of the Jews. The Jews are being blamed for everything, including for the Black Death in the 1300s. The Jews were supposedly poisoned the wells and gave everyone the bubonic plague. And so everywhere they went, they were persecuted, and the much of the work of the Inquisition in Spain was in ferreting out people who were Jews and maybe tried not to admit they were Jews. But we also have to remember in John 19 verse 15, the chief priests answered, you could say they answered on behalf of the people, we have no king but Caesar. So they're effectively cutting themselves off from Jesus and cutting themselves off from any kingdom other than that of Caesar. So we see here quite clearly that whatever these verses, whatever they represent in Revelation chapter 12, they aren't referring to the remnant of the Jews. Now we come to a few verses that seem to be talking in a spiritual context in Revelation 12 and verse 7, and there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels. Now obviously the dragon isn't in the presence of God in some kind of heavenly realm. You might say that he's ruling over the kingdoms of the earth, but certainly not as you might conceive of heaven as being in the presence of God, but maybe in the political heavens of the earth. And prevailed not, neither was in their place found any more in heaven. Talk there about the devil being defeated. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. And what we really see here is symbolic language, and what it's talking about is the devil is cast down in the hearts of minds of men, no longer reigning over people, no longer reigning in the hearts of people now that they've received the Holy Spirit. He has no power over them at all, and he's cast down to the people of the earth, the Gentiles, those that are outside the covenant of God. In Luke chapter 10, reading from verse 17, it talks there about the disciples that had been sent out, and they went out healing, and it says, and the 70 returned again with joy, saying, Lord, even the devils are subject unto us through thy name. And he said unto them, I beheld Satan as lightning fall from heaven. But behold, I give unto you power to tread on the serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you. Notwithstanding in this rejoice not that the spirits are subject unto you, but rather rejoice because your names are written in heaven. So we see here Jesus in the middle of his passage saying, I beheld Satan as lightning fall from heaven. And this is some kind of literal statement, or more likely he's looked at what he sees in the hearts and minds of the disciples. The people have gone out with great joy, and they've been casting out demons, and they've been healing the sick, and Satan no longer has power over them. Revelation 12 and verse 10, and I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, Now is come salvation and strength, and the kingdom of our God, and the power of his Christ, for the accuser of our brethren is cast down, which accused them before our God day and night. So the accuser is cast down, and this reminds us of Romans 8 verse 1, There is therefore now no condemnation to them which are in Christ Jesus, who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. So the accuser is cast down, and is cast down as a result of the work of Jesus, his work on the cross, and his work in filling people with the Holy Spirit. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb, and by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives unto the death. So they overcame. Just a reminder that the image of a lamb is one of a very gentle creature. Therefore rejoice, ye heavens, and ye that dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil is coming down unto you having great wrath, because he knoweth that he hath but a short time. So great rejoicing for the saints, but woe to the rest of mankind. And when the dragon saw that he was cast unto the earth, he persecuted the woman which brought forth the man-child. So having failed to destroy Jesus as a child, the dragon now turns its attention to Israel. And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into a place where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the face of a serpent. And this time, times and half a time is 3.5 prophetic years, 1260 actual years. This woman is now out of reach of a Roman Empire in the wilderness. This Roman Empire, under the control of the devil, is unable to strike at the woman. This kind of language we see before, all the way back in the Exodus chapter 19 and verse 4. You've seen what I did unto the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings, and brought you unto myself. If therefore ye will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine. Ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel. And Revelation 12 verse 15, and the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away of the flood. So the serpent tries to continue to destroy Israel. Verse 16, and the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon cast out of his mouth. And when we look at the events in terms of historical events that have been happening in the region, we see huge swathes of barbarian tribes coming from the east, the Goths and the Ostrogoths and the Huns all coming and causing other nations to spread away to the east. They're saying, I'm getting out of here with those scary folks arriving on the scene. So the dragon sends a flood of barbarian tribes to attack Israel. But the barbarian tribes turn and instead of going after Israel, they decide to attack the Roman Empire. It's very hard to get good help these days, isn't it? They won't do what they tell you. So they go after the wealth of Rome, and they sack Rome multiple times, trying to get as much wealth as they can, until eventually they destroy the Roman Empire. So a woman gets this chance to flee away. But a secondary effect of attacking Rome is that Rome has to withdraw its troops out of Britain and takes away its control from Britain. And so there's a power vacuum. So this allows the migrations of many tribes into Britain at exactly the right time. And this is a diagram depicting the migrations of the various tribes that have come across, the Huns and the Ostrogoths and the Vandals and all these other people that have driving the others in the westward direction. Barbarian hordes, instead of attacking the migrating tribes, turn their attention to Rome, and so the Roman troops have to leave Britain to defend the home country. And then in the final verse here, Revelation chapter 12 and verse 17, and the dragon was wroth with the woman, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God, and have a testimony of Jesus Christ. So those which have a testimony of Jesus Christ are the Spirit-filled church. So the dragon's full of wrath, really angry, tried to attack the woman, the scattered tribes of Israel, and fail. So now the dragon goes after the church. And this can be said to have started certainly by 610 AD. This really is starting to happen. So the tribes have migrated into Britain in the 500s, and now by about the 600s we start to see real persecution of a church. and the story continues in the following chapter. And you'll have to listen to the next presentation to find out what happens. Thank you for listening.